Thank you. Welcome everybody. We have a large number of people on the call. I think we're up over 1,500 probably by now, are we? My name's John McKillop. I'm the independent chair of the Red Meat Advisory Council. Just for everyone's background, we started a working group industry task force about 3 months ago, nearly 4 months ago, called the Industry Task Force on Lumpy Skin Disease. Now, over the last few months, we've been working away on various aspects of that, including keeping that LSD within Indonesia, making sure that if it comes into Australia, we're prepared for it, negotiation of trade protocols around an exotic disease such as LSD coming in, how we would contain it within Australia, and then also how we would handle communications. Now, obviously, in the last month or so, that group has expanded. So that group task force is made up of members of the Red Meat Advisory Council, Cattle Council, sheep producers, etc., represented by RMAC, National Farmers Federation, and because it was a bovine-specific disease, it has included the dairy industry. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we've extended that to cover foot and mouth disease as well, and consequently, we've brought in the pork industry and the wool industry. So it is a true industry task force. There has been a lot of work has been done in the background to the point now where we're actually, in some of those working groups, we're quite comfortable sitting down now waiting for the next step. But I just want to emphasise on both fronts, lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease, the absolute #1 priority is to keep it out of Australia. Now, we have to be prepared that may not be the case, but that's our absolute commitment from industry and from the government that we keep it out. Now, if we aren't able to keep it out, our next step is how do we handle it if it comes into Australia? So today we're going to have up to an hour. We'll allow a little bit of time at the end of it for questions. There won't be questions at the end of each speaker because we've got so many people on the meeting. But we are lucky to have the Minister is able to join us, Murray Watt, and Murray has been working on this tirelessly along with many others. So we're very lucky that the Minister has been able to join us to give us a very an update, up-to-the-minute briefing on what's been happening. We then will go to Fiona Simpson, who everyone knows, the President of the National Farmers Federation, Dr. Chris Parker, who heads up the National Animal Exotic Disease Preparedness Coordinator, and Chris also, I know, has been doing endless briefings to people and working tirelessly on it, as has Samantha Allen, who's our next speaker after that, so from Animals Health Australia. And as you're all aware, Animals Health Australia will be charged with the AusVet plan, which is the preparedness plan. So I won't go on too much longer. Questions at the end of it. We won't have a lot of time to do a lot of them, but we'll do as many as we can, and we'll try and pick some of the bigger topics if we can. So I'm going to hand over now to the Minister. Thanks, Minister. Over to you.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks to you, Fiona, and everyone who's organised this webinar about a really important topic that I know people are extremely worried about. I really appreciate the opportunity to have a quick chat with you from a government perspective, to just give you a bit more information about what we're doing in response to this, and also to get some more feedback, whether it be from industry leaders or from farmers, about what more we can be doing. Chris Parker from the Department of Agriculture, as you say, who's been extremely involved in our efforts around FMD, LSD and a range of other things, is here as well, to take some feedback and provide a bit more detail than I will give about what we're doing. But I guess the very first thing that I wanted to say to everyone is I and our government are taking this incredibly seriously. I know that people are incredibly stressed about the possibility of foot and mouth in particular, but also lumpy skin getting into the country. And that's why we have been working day and night in partnership with industry to do whatever we can to keep this disease out. Before I sort of say a bit more about what we're doing and what we're planning to do, the other message that I really want to give you, because there has been some misreporting of this today, is that Australia remains FMD free ASF, African swine fever free, and LSD, lumpy skin disease free as well. I'll give you a quick overview of some detections that we've made around FMD and ASF in recent days, but the key message for all of us to be saying, and I'll keep saying in the media just as I did today, is that we are FMD free. And the reason that matters, as all of you know, is that if we get an international reputation for having FMD, then that's going to be devastating for our livestock industry and our export industry. I said it today in my press conference. I've said it today in other media, and I'll be saying it again tomorrow. And I know that a lot of industry people have been doing the same thing. And it's pretty unfortunate that some media outlets have reported that we have FMD in Australia when that is not the case. Just very quickly, in terms of what we've done so far and what we're planning to do from here. And again, I want to thank the really valuable feedback that I've already had from industry leaders about what we should be doing. And we've tried to bring in a lot of those things as quickly as we can, as well as doing things that we have decided independently of industry need to be done. And I should say that the way I've tried to approach this is to act on the best biosecurity advice that I possibly can get. And I'm confident that I'm getting that advice. One of the things I've said in some of the media that I've done is that one of the ways our country has largely got through COVID in pretty good shape compared to the rest of the world is that political leaders like me listened to the scientific experts and took the action that was needed. Sometimes it wasn't popular, but it was the right action, and it's what has helped us get to where we got to on COVID, noting that we're looking at another wave about to start. And that's the approach I intend to take with this as well. You know, I've received a lot of feedback from people with lots of ideas, and we're working our way through them. Some of those ideas have been really spot on and we've taken up. There are some other ideas which look appealing, and I can understand why people are putting them forward, but the biosecurity advice I've been getting is that they won't necessarily work. And what we've got to do as a government and as an industry, I think, is make sure that our resources are directed to what's going to work, rather than things that may sound good but may not well. So hopefully you've seen some of the media I've done in recent days outlining the measures that we've taken. To give the former government their due, when FMD first hit Indonesia, some measures were implemented to tighten biosecurity requirements at the border. But literally within 24 hours of that outbreak reaching Bali, we had ramped up those measures at the border with increased screening. We are now at a point where 100% of passengers who come in from Indonesia are risk profiled. So their travel history is examined, where they've been in the past, their past biosecurity is examined to then determine whether they face more intensive screening of their person, of their luggage, of their travel history. And that screening is occurring. I underwent it myself the other day when I came back in from Indonesia, as I think Fiona did when she came back from Indonesia as well. So we're doing much more biosecurity screening at the airport of people, of luggage and parcels. I announced the other day that we're going to be employing 18 more biosecurity officers in airports and mail centres to take that coverage even further. We're redeploying detector dogs to some of the main airports that receive inbound traffic from Bali. And of course, I visited Indonesia last week for high-level meetings with some of their ministers and announced that we were providing 1 million vaccines for foot and mouth disease to Indonesia. That comes on top of the vaccines that we've already provided for lumpy skin disease. And we intend to be doing a lot more work with vaccines and technical assistance to Indonesia, Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea as soon as we possibly can. There's a range of other things that we have announced, but I might leave it at that in terms of what we've done. But what some of you may have also seen from the media that I did today, that we made a further announcement today, having done the major things that the biosecurity experts have told us need to be done. What we've now done is move on to some of the other measures that may not be quite as significant in a biosecurity sense, but are still worthwhile doing and will complement the other measures. So today what I announced is that we are rolling out sanitised foot mats to every international airport in Australia, and we will be targeting them at the gates of airports which are receiving inbound flights from Indonesia. Now, I might as well acknowledge up front, there's been a lot of discussion about foot baths, and again, people have given me their views on that. We have been working on this since the outbreak first got to Bali, and I've been pushing and pushing and pushing the department, as Chris Parker will tell you, to get moving on this. And where we've got to, I didn't want to be one of those politicians who goes out and makes an announcement that never actually happens. We've seen too much of that in our history. I wanted to be confident that we could deliver this, and we can. So we have purchased these foot mats. They are currently being shipped to airports around the country. We expect them to start being seen in some airports, particularly Darwin and Cairns, in the next couple of days, and we will roll them out as quickly as we possibly can to the other international airports as well. Now, I don't want to pretend that those foot mats are the silver bullet, and there's not one of these things that we're doing that is the silver bullet, but I accept that they will raise people's awareness about the need to take action, and they will help. They won't be everything we need to do, and some of the other measures that we're already doing probably have more effect from a biosecurity perspective, but they're worthwhile doing, and that's what we'll do. And again, I've said repeatedly that if we find that there are practical, effective measures that we can implement, then we'll be the first to do them. So I expect that we'll be able to announce more and more measures in coming days and weeks as we get the best biosecurity advice about what is needed. I might just quickly say, I know there's a lot of interest in the other thing that I made public today, which is the detection of viral fragments in a small number of meat products in Australia. I was advised of this very recently, and I thought it was my responsibility to make that information public as quickly as I could. So in short, and Chris might be able to elaborate on this, in short, the routine surveillance exercises that we undertake as a matter of course in retail operations uncovered a very small number of sausage products imported from overseas that contained viral fragments of FMD and ASF, African swine fever. And when I say very small, I mean 1 or 2 sausages or products that contain this. That has been detected, and those we are now in the process of seizing those products from supermarket or from the shelves of the outlets that have been selling them and distributing them, along with seizing them from a warehouse as well. But as I said at the outset, despite these detections, Australia does remain free of foot and mouth disease and free of African swine fever. At one level, the fact that we've picked these up shows that our systems work. This is why we do those routine inspections, to pick up these kind of things. And the measures that I've announced in the last couple of days around more biosecurity officers mean that we'll be able to do even more intensive surveillance of these kind of things, particularly when it comes to parcels. Because the advice that I've been receiving is that as much as people are very concerned about travellers returning from Bali and what might be on their shoes, and that is an issue, the biggest risk that we face is these diseases coming into Australia via animal products. And that's why we're increasing the surveillance on it, and we're increasing public awareness campaigns, and we'll continue to do so as well. The other thing I just wanted to address was that I know there have been calls from some quarters to bring in travel bans to Bali or to Indonesia. Again, the advice that I've received is that that is not necessary at this point in time. And I note that there's been a lot of farm industry leaders who have said that that would not be a good idea in terms of the relationship that we have with Indonesia and that important trading relationship. But I also make the point that Indonesia is not the first country that has seen a foot and mouth disease outbreak. There are currently outbreaks and have been for years in places like Vietnam, China, Malaysia, South Africa, and we've never instituted travel bans for those countries. And I might say we've never actually put in place foot mats or some of the other things that we're doing in response to those outbreaks that we've seen overseas. So I feel pretty confident in saying that the response we've seen from the current federal government is stronger than we've ever seen from any federal government in response to an outbreak that we've seen before, and certainly over the last decade or so. The other thing I was just going to say, just to go back to the meat products, is that this is not the first time in Australia's history, or even in our recent history, that we have detected viral fragments in meat products that have been brought into the country. It was detected last year, and I think there's about 4 occasions over the last 5 to 10 years where this has happened. It hasn't shut down our livestock industry. It didn't require some of the sort of drastic measures that people are talking about, and we will manage this one just as it's been managed in the past, in a sensible way that is based on advice, that takes the threat seriously. those past occasions, it didn't get out into the wider community, and I have absolutely no intention of allowing that to happen this time either. So hopefully you can tell from the passion that I'm speaking with that I take this really seriously, and I'm constantly directing my department to take more and more action, constantly in contact with your industry leadership about what more we can do, and I welcome any feedback we can possibly receive, because this is a shared responsibility. As all of you know, biosecurity is not any one person's job. It's partly the federal government's job, and I'm stepping up to the plate to do my share. It's industry's job, and they are stepping up. I had a very good meeting this afternoon with every state and territory agriculture minister to talk through what more they can be doing, particularly in the event if we did have an outbreak. And it's, of course, the travelling public's responsibility, it's farmers' responsibility, it's retailers' responsibility. We all need to play a role here, but I can absolutely assure you that I have been and will continue to take my share of the responsibility to keep this devastating disease out of our country. I might leave it at that, John, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with people directly. I think you're just on mute there. There we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Minister. Look, and I want to back that up, that as far as the task force is concerned, the government's been really working closely with industry on this and doing everything they can. Just want to point out, just emphasise a couple of points there. First, that the detection of FMD fragments doesn't mean a live virus. So there's a clear distinction there that these were fragments, not the virus itself. It may be, but there's no evidence of that. So don't sort of everyone get alarmed and think we have FMD in the country. There's no evidence to say that we do. So before I go to Fiona, I just want to again thank the department for all their work they're doing. I know everyone's working hard. I know there's a lot of people who have want to solve the world by harsh measures, but we live in the real world where we have to work with Indonesia as well as trying to keep us free from FMD. So I'm going to hand over to Fiona Simpson from the National Farmers Federation, who recently attended a trip to Indonesia with the Minister, and just her thoughts and what she found up there. Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks so much, John, and thank you, Minister, very much for coming at very short notice tonight. We've certainly felt that, pending your availability, it was good for you to be able to talk to people. So I'm glad that it all worked out and you're able to join us. And I think it will make some of our other presenters, including myself, a little bit shorter, because you've been able to put so much information out there, which is so good. As you mentioned, Minister, you and I attended Indonesia and spent a couple of days in Indonesia just last week, and it was originally intended to be a larger industry delegation, but due to several issues around emergencies here in Australia, but also I think the situation of the FMD outbreak in Indonesia being at the state that it is, at the end of the day, it was me that accompanied you on behalf of industry. It was great to be able to do that, and I think to show a united front between government and industry in terms of the support that we are wanting to make sure we can offer to the Indonesian government, particularly as they come to terms with trying to get on top of these two rather large outbreaks in very short time. So to be able to speak, so whilst you were speaking to government and making the offers of the extra vaccines, of course, and other things, then I was talking to industry stakeholders. I was talking to smallholder farmers in terms of some dairy farmers and horticultural producers, and the dairy farmers in particular were really, really worried about what the disease may well do to their businesses and their families and their farms, and also some of the smallholder farmers that just have one or two cows. And I think that's the difficulty, and the thing is that in Indonesia it's a very, very different system to Australia. The most of the cattle are held by smallholder farmers, and you're looking at people who have literally one or two cattle. So the disease has spread quite quickly up there, and as we all know, recently it was confirmed in Bali, but Bali was the last point of incursion at this point. So the Indonesian government absolutely trying to get on top of it. We also met with some feedlotters, people who, Australian companies and Australian people with feedlots and Indonesian people as well. And there's a huge focus there on making sure that they can vaccinate their cattle and also help vaccinate their surrounding landholders to try and get on top of it. And it was good to be able to reiterate our support. They were asking for help, and it was so good to be able to be there with the minister and actually offering some of that help and taking on board feedback and us giving feedback too about things that they could do that perhaps would help. And I think around the time of that visit, we actually were able to see warning signs coming into Bali. We were able to see some sanitation mats, some similar to what we're having here in Australia, put in place, and the government, particularly in relation to Bali, starting to step up to try and control the ins and the outs of what was happening there. They've also changed the way that the disease is being the responsibility of the responsible agency in terms of the Indonesian, and the same agency that is looked after the COVID response is now in charge of the response to FMD, and they did an excellent job with that. So, I have full faith that with some support, and of course there are other places that they will look to for support, that they will get on top of it. And it was certainly good to be able to see for myself the situation in Indonesia. I think it's worth just pointing out, as the Minister said, there is FMD in probably around 20 countries, 20 other countries around the world. In fact, one of the product that was found in the Melbourne shop today, the pork floss, actually it didn't come from Indonesia, it came from China. With just the fragments in it, not the live virus, just the fragments. So, it is a risk always. And the reason that it is heightened now is because, the other countries are more controlled. It has been in those countries longer, and it has been better controlled with vaccination. But, really, these are the sorts of risks that are facing Australia all the time, which is why we are continually saying, yes, we've found viral fragments before. These are good examples of what our system working, but we need to make sure it continues to work in the face of these increasing threats. So it's been good to be working together in industry. The task force that John has talked about, it has been operating for many months now, when we've had very good input from government. We thank government, the department, the minister for that. And we continue to look at making sure we have best practice in Australia for biosecurity. We have the best, safest, highest quality food in the world. Our Australian consumers depend on it, so do others around the world, and so we need to make sure we keep it like that and can support our other countries around us, because strong neighbouring countries are also strong biosecurity systems for us as well. So right now, just making sure we're doing whatever we can do, keeping on stepping up, and we thank the Minister for his openness and willingness to keep looking at what is best practice, what we can possibly do to assure us that we are doing everything we possibly can. So thank you very much, John. I'll leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. And that's great input and great insights, having been up in Indonesia recently to see what's actually happening up there. So I'm going to hand over to Chris Parker now, who no doubt has one of the hardest jobs in Australia at the moment. Chris will be known to many of you, but Chris is a vet by background, but today looks after the Animal Exotic Disease Preparedness Group, is the coordinator of that, and spends a lot of his time explaining to industry what is happening and what the implications are of both lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease. So I'm going to hand over to Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thank you for those kind words, but I don't think my job, it pales into insignificance compared with the Minister, and I think we are very lucky to have someone of the intellectual rigour and the energy of the current Minister and his engagement on this issue. From my perspective as a farmer, has been just outstanding. So, and I'm not just saying that because he's on the line. Anyway, I thought what it might be useful, John, if we just go through for everyone, so we're all working from the same base of knowledge, where we've come from. And in March, there was the first diagnosis of LSD, lumpy skin disease, in Indonesia. The department immediately stood up a task force to work our way through what preparedness might look like for Australia, and how we might protect Australia from an incursion of lumpy skin disease. That very quickly in May, when we had the diagnosis of foot and mouth disease, FMD, in Indonesia, got rolled together in an exotic disease task force. Now, we've continued to do work in regard to preparedness for lumpy skin disease. There is a concern, of course, because these diseases are slightly different. Lumpy skin disease is a disease that's spread by insects, and biting insects is the way that it's spread. It's a pox virus. It affects cattle and also it affects buffalo, so bovids. It's one of the diseases we are very concerned about because it could enter the country through an unregulated pathway. And by that I mean, if it spreads further east and south in Indonesia, it may be close enough to blow in on an insect, and that's a great deal of concern. So clearly the work we're doing around the preparedness plan, and we've had 3 workshops consulting with industry and state governments about what that plan might look like, has significant components of surveillance activity in the north, and vector monitoring, of course, as well as the border operations that we do. So I know most of the energy and people's angst is around foot and mouth disease, and quite rightly. Whilst both these diseases have a significant effect on trade, and they would close markets in certain products, clearly the wider number of and types of animals that foot and mouth disease affects, because it affects all ungulates, so sheep, cattle, goats, deer, all those animals would be affected. And it has a wider and more significant trade effect. And I think all of us have probably seen that ABARES did a study and actually revamped the study just a little while ago, and it would be an $80 billion cost to the economy. So clearly we're extremely concerned about that. Now, as we've had that diagnosis of foot and mouth disease, and there's been plans in place for many, many years in Australia. And in fact, some would say that's why we actually have a biosecurity system. It was probably why it was designed in the first place all those years ago, because foot and mouth for a trading nation, agricultural trading nation like Australia, was significant. And we've continued to have those measures in place. So we already had a very high bar compared with other nations in the world in regard to the manner in we treat biosecurity. However, as the Minister's outlined, when we had the first diagnosis in Indonesia, we had a step up in those measures at the border to ensure that we were protecting Australia and that place. When we had the outbreak in Bali, when it spread to Bali, and that was in July of this year, the Minister announced further uptick in the manner in which we were managing the border. So along with all the increased profiling, along with all the increased inspection, along with all the increased messaging, we had those officers boarding planes on arrival and playing that message and ensuring we had the compliance that was required to ensure that risk material didn't come in. We then had a further uptick when that the Minister announced recently, and that's in regard to mats, and the Minister's outlined where they've come from. It's probably worth thinking about these diseases in the sense that we've done some work, and it's not modelling, but it's around some estimates about what is the likelihood of these diseases coming in. And we've seen changes in this. So these are called structured expert judgments, and they're essentially a whole bunch of boffins with a whole bunch of different knowledge in different parts of this of the disease, and they come together and they give a structured exercise where they come up with an estimate of likelihood. And that estimate has increased for LSD from an 8% chance of LSD coming to this country within 5 years in March 2021, and in April 2022 that had increased to 28%. So whilst I don't want you to interpret these figures as absolutes, what they do show is the risk increases, and the risk is increasing, and that's why we're putting these measures in place, and that's why we have these national plans. For foot and mouth disease, the equivalent structured judgment was 9% in March 2021, and that increased to nearly 12% in June 2022. Again, they're not absolute figures, but what they do show is the risk. The experts judgment is that the risk increases, and that's why we're putting in place the plan, the national plan around lumpy skin disease, and that's why we're putting in place the increased border measures associated with foot and mouth disease. It is worth reflecting. We have always had a biosecurity system that had pre-border components, border components, and post-border components. The pre-border components, we've had a significant investment going into Indonesia to assist them to manage their disease situation. And the minister's made a number of announcements around vaccine, around increasing biosecurity knowledge, about some partnerships with industry, and of course, most recently, another $5 million to go towards assisting partners in Indonesia, in Timor-Leste, and also in PNG, to ensure that we're able to provide the level of support that these sovereign nations are asking us for. The other component of the $14 million is around boosting what's occurring at the border. So that's that second component. And then I know in the last few days there has been discussions around AusVet plan and what we do in a preparedness state or post-border. So I wanted to get the message across that this is a structured response. It's a measured response. There is funds available that are being used in this response. And I think that we should be assured that the government, and certainly the department that I'm part of, and certainly at the direction of my minister, is doing everything across those three different areas that we can. And that applies for both FMD and for LSD, both of which, as I remind us, is a bit of a worry. And I think that we just don't want to lose sight of LSD in all the fuss that we're seeing around foot and mouth disease. And as Fiona pointed out before, we've been dealing with foot and mouth disease in countries for many, many years. We dealt with it when there was an active outbreak in the UK, and we didn't stop people coming from the UK. We've dealt with it when it's been in China, when it's in Vietnam, when it's in Thailand, when it's in South Africa. We've dealt with this for many, many years. The reason that we've had this uptick with Indonesia is, as Fiona pointed out, it is an active, uncontrolled infection at the moment. So what's our end game? Our end game with Indonesia is to assist them to get this under control. Once it's under control, they are probably no greater risk as a country or travel to that country than any of the other countries around the world, because it's under control. And by under control, we mean there are not large amounts of virus in the environment, and we're not seeing active spread. Now, at the moment, we're seeing increasing numbers of infected animals in Indonesia, and that's not unexpected. And I actually, Minister, got the latest figures literally hot off the press just before I came on. Now, at the moment, it looks like there's about 401,000 animals infected in Indonesia, and it looks like they've had about 550,000 have been vaccinated. So what that shows is that there's active infection, but we're also seeing control measures starting to really kick in. And Fiona pointed out that with some of the movement of those control measures into the Disaster Recovery Agency, who I remind people the Minister met with when he was in Indonesia, we've seen, I think, maybe a more purposeful rollout of control measures than what we might have seen in the initial few weeks. And quite rightly, in the initial few weeks, things are tough. On LSD, LSD's at the moment has a slightly different distribution, and it's still, all reports saying it's still on the island of Sumatra only. Looks like they're quoting about 3,000 animals infected and about 28,000 have been vaccinated. Folks, I think given their focus on FMD, I'm not sure how much stock we should be putting in those numbers. I suspect the numbers might be higher on both sides, because both the numbers infected and the numbers vaccinated, because clearly their focus is on foot and mouth disease. But I do point out, I think one of the silver linings, if there could be a silver lining in this, is that what we've seen, I think, as we start to see a control program come into effect with FMD, people are going to be looking at animals, vaccinating animals, and I know Mark Shipp spoke to me about this. There's going to be people vaccinating both for LSD and FMD, and I think what we might see is, in fact, both diseases come under probably quicker control than what you might have seen for just one single disease. Now, I'm always an optimist, and I believe that's the silver lining that we might see with both of these going on. But I do know that what we've seen in the past, and certainly in the BTEC program in Australia, we saw this, that when we went through and had a disease eradication program around tuberculosis and brucellosis, and I'm old enough to actually remember some of that, what we did see also was improved genetics, improved animal welfare, improved animal production in areas where they really have really benefited from those things. So I would expect that as we see the rollout of these control programs in Indonesia, we may see this also an improvement in the manner in which they manage their animal population. And I think that's a positive, as it was for us during the BTEC program. So, John, I think that's probably it. I will just talk about the viral fragments. I think it's really important people understand that this is part of our post-border work. It's normal work. It's work you would expect us to do. You would expect us to be out making sure that products on the shelves are safe. Now, we have always assumed that products we are seizing at the border are infected. Now, we've been testing those, and some of those are infected, and that's what we would expect. What we would also expect to find is in that products that are imported from countries where there's been appropriate treatment, like heat treatment, you may still find the odd viral fragment in those products. In this case, again, we found that. But what wasn't clear to us was that these products had been imported appropriately. And so in an abundance of caution, particularly given the moment that we're in at the moment, given the situation we're in at the moment, we removed them from the shelves. And I think that's prudent action, and I think it's action that is appropriate to the risk in the current situation. Would remind you those products were not from Indonesia. In fact, they were from a country that's China, and I think it's important that we keep everything in context. Would I have preferred that we didn't? The results were a month later. Clearly, I would have, because you don't like to be releasing it in the current environment. But the Minister is right. We found this. It's the system working, and we feel confident that if there has been any activity that would indicate these products have not been legally imported, and I'm not saying there is because that would be preempting the investigation, you can be guaranteed that we have a full suite of penalties that can be applied, and we would look to apply those diligently, as you would expect from a good regulator. So thank you, John. Clearly, I'm happy to take questions. There's a lot happening, and I hope that gives people an understanding of where we are, how we've got there, and what we continue to do to keep the country safe.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Look, I'm going to break protocol slightly because I know the Minister has to duck off. A number of questions coming through, but one in particular relates to fines for people who breach our protocols, and both in terms of what's coming in, whether that's deliberate or illegal imports, which this isn't yet known. But can you just comment, Minister, on the plans or thoughts around increasing the fines and the penalties?
Sure, John. That is something we are very closely looking at. I think it is important that, frankly, we make an example of some people who do the wrong thing. You know, obviously, we've got to give people natural justice, and, you know, I'm not going to direct prosecutions. That's not the role of a minister, but I think it's really important that we send a strong message to people at the enforcement end as well as the awareness end. So we are seriously considering the existing penalties and whether they're sufficient as part of our response. And as I say, that goes to the point that I don't think that the measures we've introduced are the end of the matter. If there are things that people raise with us that we think that we can make a difference, then we will do them.
Great. Thanks, Minister, and thank you very much for your time. I'm aware you have other commitments, so thank you.
Yeah, I might sign off now. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Okay, our next presenter is Dr. Samantha Allen, General Manager of Emergency Preparedness at Animal Health Australia. Obviously very much at the front line. As Sam will explain, they are responsible for the AusVet plan, which is largely how Australia responds to the outbreak if we have it. So I'm going to hand over now to Sam to go through what will happen in the event of the worst case scenario.
Thank you, John. And I would like to just try and share my screen if I can, because I had some slides that I think might be helpful. you just confirm, can you see the slideshow? Great, thank you. Well, my name's Samantha Allen and I lead the technical team at Animal Health Australia. And as Don mentioned, we manage many of Australia's national preparedness and response activities. And my goal tonight is to reassure everybody who's on the webinar that we are well prepared to defend Australia against emergency animal disease. We have robust response plans and a cost-sharing deed, and these have been in place for 20 years. We also have a pool of experienced, trained people in the jurisdictions and in industry, and they're ready to mobilise in the event of an outbreak of emergency animal disease. In fact, this group of people, and I'm one of them, have had prior experience with eradicating many diseases, including the very large equine influenza outbreak in 2007, and several avian influenza outbreaks, with the most recent one in 2020, which happened in the middle of a COVID lockdown. Australia has also successfully responded to multiple plant emergency diseases and aquatic emergency animal diseases, and the principles of the response are the same regardless of the agent. So I just want to give a little bit of information about the AusVet plan. I hope most people have heard of it by now. The AusVet plan is a series of manuals that set out the agreed national response policies and guidelines to help guide the response to over 60 emergency diseases. The manuals and the supporting documents are all available online, and if you want to scan the QR code, you'll be taken to Animal Health Australia's website and you can have a look at the documents yourself. The response strategies for each disease are regularly reviewed, and this is done by an expert writing group comprising representatives from government and the relevant industries. The foot and mouth disease and the lumpy skin disease AusVet plan manuals are currently under review in response to the increased risks that we're facing now, and to ensure that they contain the latest and most accurate information. So the other really important tool that we've got is the Iadra, or the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement. The Iadra is a pre-agreed national cost-sharing deed, which sets out the decision-making process for how we will set up a response, and also for how the cost of that response will be shared by the signatories to the Iadra. It's unique in the world, and it was signed in 2002. There are 24 signatories, which represent the state and territory governments, the Commonwealth Government, and the key livestock industry peak councils. So the value of the Iadra is that it sets up a decision-making framework which can be activated instantly if we need to go into a response. And the parties to the Iadra, as I mentioned, peak livestock industry councils, the state and territory governments, and the Commonwealth Government, and Animal Health Australia is the custodian of the deed. I'd like to give a little bit more detail then about what happens during an EAD outbreak. And as I said, we've done this before. The flow chart that's on the slide there, it might be a little too small for people to read tonight, but it is available on our website. And it just shows you that we do have an established process of what we do, right from the very beginning when we suspect an emergency disease, right through to the end when hopefully we've eradicated it and we close the response down. The first phase in the orange is the important part where the public and livestock producers are really important. It's looking at reporting the emergency animal disease, and we need that to be done really, really quickly. The sooner that we pick up a disease, the earlier we can start the response, and the more likely we'll be to be successful. So this relies on people knowing the signs of disease and calling their private vet or the EAD hotline or a government vet the minute they think they see anything that looks suspicious. That then sets up a process for the disease to be investigated by veterinarians, and if there is a high index of suspicion that it's a serious disease, the Chief Veterinary Officer of the state or territory will become involved and a formal process will begin. The next phase, the green phase, is what we call the incident definition phase, and this is where things start to get very serious. If we have a high suspicion that we have an emergency disease, laboratory samples will go to our national laboratory, the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, and the Australian Chief Veterinary Officer is notified, and they then prepare to stand up the national emergency decision-making committees. And all of that happens within 24 hours. past that. I thought I might just also give a little bit more detail about what might happen in a foot and mouth disease response, because that's the one that we're all, I guess, so worried about at the moment. The QR code there, if people want to scan that, will take you to the AusVet Plan manual, if you care to have a look at that later. And just to give you a bit of a summary about the disease, foot and mouth disease is a virus. It's an acute, which means a really fast-acting disease, which is highly infectious. As Chris pointed out, it affects cloven-hoofed animals, so that's cattle, buffalo, pigs, sheep, goats and deer, also alpaca as well. It's one of the most contagious animal diseases that we know. It's really easily spread, and pigs are important in a foot and mouth disease outbreak, because an infected pig produces a lot of virus, which they then excrete back into the environment, which becomes a source of infection for other animals. It's also really important for people to know that this disease cannot infect people. It's not a safety risk for people, and meat products are also safe to eat, you know, in the event that we did have an outbreak here in Australia. As we know, we're even more concerned because the disease is in Bali. And I think somebody before me mentioned one of the tools that we do have for response is a vaccine bank for foot and mouth disease vaccine. It's held overseas, but it's there ready to be activated the minute that we need it. Vaccine can be here in Australia within 7 days if we order it. So the response strategy itself for foot and mouth disease, the key thing is rapid response. As I said, foot and mouth disease, it's highly contagious, it spreads rapidly, and the movement of infected animals is the biggest risk factor for it spreading in Australia if it got here. One of the other goals of the response would be to minimise the social and economic impacts. And the way that we're going to go about eradication is through a stamping out policy. And what that means is that we remove infected animals from the population as soon as we identify that they're infected or that there's a high risk that they could be. One of the key tools that we'll use in the first 72 hours of a response will be a national livestock standstill. And I think a lot of livestock producers are already aware of the concept of this. The standstill will be called across the country, and it will last for 72 hours in the first instance. And it will restrict the movement of all foot and mouth disease susceptible animals for that period. The reason that we have it is to give the authorities a chance to try and get ahead of the virus. During that 72 hours, they will be tracing, investigating properties and trying to get the clearest idea that we can about where the disease is, where could it potentially have spread, and that will help us to know how to roll out the response. Once the national standstill is over, it will be replaced by different movement controls called declared areas, and they will be based on the knowledge of where the disease is and the risk, in different geographical areas. I've just got a little bit more information about that. So as I said, the livestock standstill will be for the 72 hours in the beginning. The easing, lifting or extending of the standstill will be based on a risk assessment and the developing knowledge of the epidemiology of the outbreak. People have asked what will happen to animals that are in transit at the time that a standstill happens, because, we don't know when it'll happen. There will be animals in trucks moving around. And the current policy is that animals can continue to their destination, provided that the journey can be completed within 4 hours of the standstill being called, and that they do not cross a state border. So some animals will be able to continue to their destination. Some people might decide that the best thing is to turn around and return to the point of origin. There will be some people with livestock in transit that will need to contact the jurisdiction to get specific advice on that particular movement, particularly if they were planning to cross a border or the intended destination has told them that, that they can't proceed. So there will be measures in place. It will be the jurisdictions that provide that guidance, and it's impossible to tell people now what that might be. It will really depend on what a response looks like if it happens. So this is just to give a little bit of an idea of what will happen after the standstill. We should have a lot of information, about where the disease is, possible movements and traces will be being investigated. So that will allow us to set up restricted areas, and they will be the areas where we know that there is infection or where we have a very high suspicion that infection is present. It won't necessarily be a circle. The shape of the area will be based on risk assessment and what we know, about where the disease is. It will probably conform to property boundaries or something like that. It's just a circle there to make it easy to show you. So outside the restricted area, which is the highest risk area, we have control areas. And the control areas are areas where there is increased risk, but we're not certain that infected animals are there. So it could be areas where we know movements have happened from an infected property and we haven't had a chance to investigate those yet, or other information that leads us to believe that the risk is high. And then away from the control areas, we have the outside areas, and they are areas where we believe that there's no infection and that we're trying to protect. So to support, those control areas and try and facilitate eradication of the disease as quickly as possible, there will be very strict movement requirements between the different areas. Probably there won't be anything allowed to move out of restricted areas unless it's for welfare reasons or some other very special condition. And then movements between outside area and control areas will all be based on risk assessment and will be done, through a permitting system. The main reason being to protect the outside area and try and shrink the control and restricted areas as quickly as possible. I should just also mention that it's not just live animals that we're worried about. Other things such as semen and embryos, meat and milk, wool and fibres, the things that are on the list there will also be subject to movement restrictions, and that'll be handled by the control centres set up by the jurisdictions. There'll be information, when a response happens, there will be information available. There'll be a permitting system and a way to apply to move things. So that's just to give people a guide, of how things might turn out. It very much depends on what a response looks like, how big it is, and hopefully how quickly we've detected it. So just finally, I wanted to put up this final slide for people if you're interested in signing up to Animal Health Australia's disease alert updates. Another QR code if you want to grab that with your phone and sign up for our disease updates later. And that's all from me. Thank you, John.
Great, thanks, Samantha, and great insights there. So we've got a few questions that are coming through, so I'm going to pass the first one through to you, Samantha. Questions around feral animal control and what's been done, and then also if there's an outbreak within that inner circle, how do we assure that the feral animal population isn't breaching that, because obviously they don't play by the same rules?
Thanks, John. That's a good question. I think we are lucky to have the national coordinators for most of the the major feral animal types that we have in Australia, and those people are working full-time all the time at the moment trying to promote and implement national eradication and control programs for pigs and deer and those sort of things. So I think that work's happening in the background all the time. The AusNet Plan Manual does review the risk of feral animals in a response, and again it would really depend on where it happened. Northern Australia does have a large population of feral cattle, feral pigs and feral buffalo, and so that's obviously an extremely high risk area. If an outbreak happens somewhere where there's more intensive type agriculture, there are feral animals there, but I think the risk isn't quite so large. So I think, of course, depending on the situation that we faced, risk assessments would be done, efforts would be put into ramping up feral animal control in those areas if required, but we do also have just that background work that's happening all the time.
Great, thanks, Samantha. The next question that seems to be coming up a fair bit, both within this forum and others, is probably directed at Chris in the first case. Why aren't we out there now? We have a bank of FMD vaccinations in the UK. We can call on them. 7 days later, it's here. Why aren't we just on the front foot and vaccinating now?
That's actually a really good question, because we've controlled so many diseases in the country for so long with vaccination. The main reason FMD is so catastrophic to Australia is its trade effects. We will be shut out of nearly every single market. So what are the rules around trade? The rules around trade are essentially there are three groups. The first group is you've got foot and mouth disease. That shuts you out of just about every market. The second group is you don't have foot and mouth disease, but you're still actively vaccinating. So it's called foot and mouth free with vaccination. That only allows you access to some markets. And then the third would be foot and mouth free without vaccination. And that's what Australia is. And that means we have access to a wide number of markets. So two things would happen if we started vaccinating. One, we would lose access to those markets overnight. Two, we'd have a whole lot of trading partners asking us, why are you vaccinating for foot and mouth disease? Do you have foot and mouth disease? And we would just be then probably locked out of other markets out of suspicion as much as anything. So to start using vaccine as a prophylactic, if you like, treatment for a disease we don't have would have significant trade effects in a whole range of markets. And that's why we're not doing it, John.
Right. Thanks, Chris. And as we said at the outset, the aim is very much to keep FMD and LSD out of Australia. So I suppose a question for Fiona that's coming up a lot is, what are we actually doing in country to support the Indonesian campaign to get control of particularly foot and mouth disease?
Yeah, thanks, John. And that's a really good question. So there's a few things that we're doing, and Chris will have to back me up if I forget any of them. The first most important thing is access to vaccines. So right now we have a situation in Indonesia where they are trying to get on top of it. We now have the Emergency Management Agency looking after it, who, as I said, did a really good job with COVID. We know that they've now initiated zones. So Sam spoke to you about the zones that would or might be initiated if we had an outbreak here in Australia. In Indonesia, they have red zones, orange zones and green zones. So it's about helping the government get some control, I think, around those borders. So where do they vaccinate? How do they vaccinate? How do they identify that animals are actually vaccinated? In Australia, we have NIS, we have a traceability system. In Indonesia, they don't. So there's work right now going on, and the Australian government is very much helping with some of these questions that we have struggled with and are very good at here in Australia. We've perfected it over the years in terms of traceability, in terms of biosecurity. How do you identify animals? Some of the laboratory procedures that we might take for granted here in Australia around testing animals, returning those positive tests so that we can have quick action, and then making sure that we can help with tracking those animals. So an animal actually needs more than one vaccine. You have to vaccinate the animals and then go back and vaccinate again. In Indonesia, it's not like here in Australia. In Australia, most animals are held in farms within fences. So first of all, it's easy to vaccinate the animals because you put them into a yard situation and then vaccinate. In Indonesia, you're looking at working with multiple landholders. In a 20k zone, there could be 6,000 or 10,000 landowners, all with one or two cattle. So it's a matter of, first of all, helping the landowners test, track, trace, vaccinate those animals, and then doing it again. So those are all the places that the Indonesian government has indicated to us that they'd really like some support on. They are the places where Australia is very strong at. So in addition to those 1 million vaccines that will be arriving in Indonesia at the very beginning of August to bolster their own supply of vaccines, we are actually helping with, as I say, laboratory testing, the vaccinations, and also identification and trialling some identification, very simple tracking and identification methods that will really help the smallholder farmers and the larger industries in terms of getting on top of it and making sure that those zones are respected. So right now they've got quite a big ban on terms of product going into Indonesia and going out of Indonesia from most of the areas. Ideally, they should be able to, as they can start to really narrow down those zones and try and get on top of the disease with vaccinations, etc. They should be able to start opening up some of the trade for from other countries, etc., that are free from foot and mouth disease. The other thing I'd just say quickly, John, is that Indonesia has been a great partner for Australia over many, many years. And while we were in Indonesia, it was great to see so many Australian products there. So our products are known to be safe because we do have good biosecurity. Yes, we need to keep making sure we can step it up, but you know, the meat that the Australian meat that you eat there, the Australian fruit and veggies, the Australian dairy, there's lots and lots of products, and we've had a really strong history of supporting Indonesia for many, many years, the live export industry as well, and it's important that we keep that relationship strong. And I think, given that's one of the reasons why the Minister was keen to get to Indonesia to meet his counterpart quite quickly, and of course he gratefully accepted the offers that Australia has. I think the Minister is always open to, just as he said earlier, he was open to increasing fines. He's open to doing, you know, whatever we can do in Indonesia to try and help them as they get on top of this disease.
Thanks, Fiona. But there's been a lot of media response and headlines around no meat on the shelves within Australia. You know, if we got FMD, look, a lot of it is well intended, but it is quite alarmist. I mean, if you think it through, it would require every area, every state, every region in Australia to simultaneously acquire FMD for that to be shut down in the longer term. But there is the question that's come up, what would happen to abattoirs and processing in the event of an FMD outbreak, and how would that work in reality? So I'm going to hand over to Samantha, if I can, to answer that one.
Yeah, sure, John. That is a really important question that we answer. And I want to say first that the response policy does not involve closing meatworks or abattoirs or anything like that as a preemptive measure. While the livestock standstill is in place, if an abattoir has animals in lairage and they, you know, needed to and wanted to, they could continue operation. I think the issue would be, you know, as Chris pointed out, if trade stops, I think, you know, product is probably going to be standing still. But the meatworks themselves would not be closed as part of the response policy. The way that they could, you know, there could be a problem is if during the tracing and investigation, if it was found that infected animals were there or had moved through the abattoir or the meatworks, it could be closed down. If it's confirmed that infection has been there, we would go into a decontamination process. And I'd have to say that with the preparations for African swine fever, you know, when that first became a high priority a couple of years ago now, we did a lot of work with the pig industry to look at, you know, how quickly could we decontaminate a processing plant, because for those that know the pork industry very well, they have, you know, quite strict timeframes and things. They need to be able to move animals through the system, you know, at a steady rate. So looking at that for the pork industry, we have developed really good protocols for disinfection of meat processing plants and abattoirs, and that could easily be rolled out to apply to a beef or a sheep processing plant. So I suppose just to be clear, they're not shut down as part of the response. If they were caught up in an infected animal tracing or something like that, the response, one of the goals of the response would be to get the place decontaminated, cleaned out and ready to operate again as quickly as possible.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Samantha. Look, I realise we're over time, but I also realise this is an interesting topic and a very important topic. So I'm just going to keep going for another 5 minutes if I can. But obviously, if people have other commitments, then thanks for your time. But just one more question that keeps coming up a lot is around compensation. We're hearing a lot about it, about how it is between government, state government and federal government and industry. And I know that I'm going to hand this to Chris, I think, in the first instance, who I think is probably across it as much as anyone. Can you just step us through the mechanisms of how that works, Chris, and how industry will have to repay and how those mechanisms will work?
I'll just give a very quick précis because Samantha will have far more of the details than I will. But look, I think a quick précis is probably useful in the sense that for a wide range of exotic disease, including foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, they are covered under the Exotic Animal Disease Response Agreement, or Iadra. and Iadra is an agreement that was done many, many years ago that essentially for a whole range of different exotic diseases in the animal space, splits the cost of compensation between the federal government, state government and industry. And I can tell you that within the federal government system, there is contingency that sits within Treasury for commitments under this, and so the money is there. For industries, from my memory, and Samantha, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, industries who wish to sign the Iadra need to have a mechanism to collect a levy, so they'll be able to pay for their component. And the experience in the past has been certainly for some industries, because usually they're zero-based levies to start with, John. The experience is state and federal governments tend to cover and then industry pays it back. As far as compensation goes, the purpose of compensation is to get early detection. And early detection is giving you compensation for animals who have the disease who may need to be euthanized to assist in controlling the disease. So that's a very quick process. Sam, add anything or that I've missed that is of relevance, or shoot me down if I've said something wrong, mate.
Thanks, Chris. I think that was a good start. I suppose I'd just like to reiterate that the purpose of compensation in emergency response is to encourage early reporting and to ensure that producers who do report are not financially disadvantaged. So that's all handled under the emergency disease response legislation of the states and territories. It's pretty similar, but slight differences between the jurisdictions. And we also need to make sure that that's not confused with recovery payments or business continuity payments, which would also be part of a major response, and they would be handled by other sectors of governments, both the state and territories and Commonwealth, and also some non-government organisations. So coming back to Iadra, Iadra it is the cost sharing mechanism for the response, and it's all of the response costs. It's the operational costs plus the compensation. From previous experience, compensation is quite a significant percentage of the total response costs, between 30 and 50%, so it is a lot. But as far as the cost sharing goes, there is a budget that's put up to the National Management Group. It's agreed by all of the parties, and then, once that's approved, it's shared amongst all of the parties according to cost sharing formulas that Chris alluded to. For foot and mouth disease, it is 80% government, 20% industry, and it's split on the GVP of the industries. The Commonwealth Government has got arrangements with all of the signatory industries to allow them to, the Commonwealth will prepay the industry share, and then they have an agreement to pay back through their levies over a 10-year period. So it's not that industries will have to come up with money straight away. They sign up to the response and the agreement to pay and have 10 years to repay the response costs. Compensation, I guess, is emotive and quite topical at the moment. And all I could say is that the purpose of it is to be fair, to make sure that people aren't disadvantaged by early reporting, and that the processes described in the AusVet plan are a starting point or a guide. It's not a rule book, it's a starting point.
Thanks, Samantha. I think the key points there is that the money doesn't have to come up front from industry, the 20%. But it does have to be repaid over 10 years with interest. So there is a component there that the industry has to fund part of that compensation. And as Samantha said, the compensation isn't about underwriting profit. It's just really about, in the first instance, if you think you have the disease, notify it. That way you won't have to suffer the consequence that benefits the whole industry. So look, on that note, we're now 10 minutes over time. I want to thank everyone for their time and their interest in this topic. Obviously, it's a very important topic for the industry. Also want to thank our presenters for their time tonight, and the minister's gone, but thank you, Samantha, thank you, Chris, thank you, Samantha, and thank you for everyone who's helped organise it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.